Thank you very much for coming. My name is William Green. I'm a professor of chemical engineering, and I'm the director of the MIT Energy Initiative. Thank you for attending and helping to support this series of discussions about our energy future. One of our jobs at the Energy Initiative is to try to keep the MIT community informed about the important work that's happening outside of MIT towards decarbonizing the energy system and solving other energy challenges. And our ultimate goal is to end up with an energy system that solves the climate change problem and also meets all the other requirements of reliability, security, cost, all the other factors that really come into a practical solution. This is a pretty difficult challenge. And so we try to convene experts from all different stakeholders, from industry, from government, from the nonprofits, and from academia. And it will require a tremendous amount of innovation to go from where we are today to an energy system that we can all be proud of. And today I have a speaker here who promotes entrepreneurship in hard tech and climate tech, is a big promoter of the development of ideas, actually many of the ideas from MIT, into real solutions that can be commercialized and deployed. And so it's very fitting that we have today Georgina Campbell Flatter, the CEO of Greentown Labs. Greentown Labs is, I believe, the biggest climate tech incubator in the world. Is this true? Yeah? And in fact, it was so successful here that it's now set up a satellite location in Houston, where it's also doing very well, I believe.
Great.
Greentown Labs works with energy entrepreneurs who are running startups in many different areas of the energy transition, and solar energy, AI, energy storage and batteries, CO2 sequestration, geothermal, all kinds of things. And so to do that, you need to be pretty flexible-minded to be able to talk to all these entrepreneurs with all these wild ideas. Most of which are probably never going to pan out, but some of them are, and we need them, the ones that are going to pan out, to actually advance as quickly as possible. So Georgina has that kind of broad background. She has a master's degree in materials engineering from Oxford, and she also has a master's degree in technology and policy from MIT. She had quite a lot of roles at MIT. She told me she started in Bob Langer's lab.
That's right.
So Bob Langer is a very famous chemical engineer from my department who invented a lot of drug delivery methods, actually quite a lot of inventions. I think he has the second most commercialized patents after Thomas Edison of anybody in the United States history. So she was right in the heart of it in that lab. But then she worked in the Martin Trust Center and as the executive director of the Legatum Center for Development and Entrepreneurship. So we have in our business school some really excellent entrepreneurship programs. And Georgina has worked in several of them. She was also the director of the MIT Clean Energy Prize and also the X Prize Lab. She's also the co-founder of TomorrowNow.org, a nonprofit that connects next-generation weather and climate technologies with farmers in Africa.
Also an MIT connection.
Also an MIT connection. So although Georgina came from England, I believe?
Wales.
Wales. Came from Wales. She's apparently well settled in here in this Cambridge on the west side of the pond. And today she's going to tell us about what Greentown Labs is working on. So please join me in welcoming Georgina.
Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you, Bill. It's such a pleasure to be back on campus. Every time I come to campus, I just get hit in the face with positivity and energy, and just have, it's the same feeling you get when you come to Greentown Labs, but I just have so much hope for the future, and seeing everybody here today in green for many of you. So thank you for appreciating that we're presenting on Greentown Labs and you're in green today. I also know that it's St. Patrick's Day, but I appreciate that all the same. And I've just had an amazing afternoon with the MIT Energy Initiative and faculty across campus. It's amazing to kind of get a glimpse into what's at the forefront of energy and climate, and kind of see the potential for how those technologies are going to change the world, and just to be in this phenomenal ecosystem. And that's really kind of a theme that I'll be picking up on throughout my presentation. I also just wanted to call out briefly my two Greentowners here, Sam and Maria Jose. So please connect with their kind of chief hustle officers at Greentown. If you're a student or a faculty in the room who is considering starting a company, and or you have a company and you're looking for a space and a community, please do connect with obviously myself, but Sam and Maho are absolutely the right people for that. So yeah, let me get started here. So let me see if I can. Yeah, this is a really kind of a full circle moment, and I'll kind of tie in some of those themes throughout the presentation. But I did start my own journey here into the kind of energy and climate and entrepreneurship ecosystem building space. And the theme today is really this idea that's very much embedded into the culture of MIT, but also has influenced how we think about and approach our work at Greentown, which is the power of and. There is this kind of defining opportunity of our time of solving for energy and climate. But the power of and doesn't stop there, right? We have to, if we really want to be driving the most transformational technologies to scale at a speed in which we need them to happen for our planet, we need to be thinking about the ecosystem that we build around it. And so thinking about the power of and through the lens of discovery and deployment, right? Thinking about the power of and through the different stakeholders that are that we work with within our MIT ecosystem, Massachusetts, the United States, the world, and thinking about how we can better work together to move forward. Thinking about through the lens of Greentown, we think about the power of and through how we can work together better in the ecosystems where we have physical presence, but also how we can connect better across ecosystems. And again, I'll kind of pick up on some of those themes throughout today. One additional thought that I did want to offer as we kind of go into the presentation here is again, thinking about, it's kind of a very timely conversation, right? It's thinking about the power of and. Our world is incredibly polarized in many ways, and there is a focus around competitiveness. Even here in Boston, there's been a conversation recently across various social media channels around Boston, is it losing its edge, right? And yes, of course, as an ecosystem as mature and as phenomenal as the one we have on our doorstep here, of course we're thinking about competitiveness, and we want to double down and be the best we can be for the ecosystem we're within. And again, this is the power of and. It's kind of embedded in our culture here to also think about how we can be collaborative, right? So it's competitiveness and collaboration that's really going to help us move the needle. At Greentown, one of our core values is innovation is a team sport. No one can go alone. That's the only way we're going to kind of reach and achieve progress at the speed we know is possible. And so again, just thinking about that power of and. So when you kind of are thinking about taking that phone call or taking that meeting, or and the word or pops up, force yourself to think about and then see where that takes you, because it's a powerful idea. So I mentioned this is a full circle moment for me. So I was digging around in my old MIT inbox, and I found this poster, which is actually, so I was actually, I benefited from support from MIT when I was a grad student here at TPP. And this is me with Ernie and Bob as a lucky recipient of a prize. And it's kind of fun to kind of reflect. So as Bill mentioned, as those of you who don't know me, I started my MIT journey in the Langer Lab, and of course, you know, I was actually an undergrad at the time, and I came over to MIT to finish up my Oxford thesis, and I got exposed to phenomenal people, phenomenal science, important problems. But that's not what really struck me about MIT at the time. What struck me, and I'm sure many of you feel this every day, it was the ecosystem that surrounded you as an innovator that helped you move faster, helped you think smarter, but also helped you think about how to make technology matter. So Bob would tell us every day in the lab, how are you making this technology matter to the patient? And for me, that was such a powerful idea as a material scientist and engineer coming from Oxford, and I have a deep appreciation and love for what Oxford gifted me, and MIT really did open my eyes to how technology can shape how we think about innovation and impact. And that mindset then pushed me to study the technology and policy program. I was lucky enough to work under Professor Fiona Murray and Bill Olet for about a decade. And I had this opportunity to think about the science behind ecosystems and the intentionality around innovation infrastructure. And it really is, this research on prizes that I did as part of my, my work with TPP is, in some ways, there's a lot of similarities between a prize and what we're doing at Greentown, right? Greentown is physical infrastructure, physical innovation infrastructure to cluster innovators in one place so we can move faster. That's simply what we do. Prizes are the same thing. You cluster innovators and smart people and creative thinkers around a particular problem in order for us to move innovation faster, move innovation forward faster. And so there is a science behind innovation policy and design in a way that, and every day at Greentown, we talk about how can we remove friction so that our startups can move faster. And it starts with clustering innovators together. Anyway, to complete my story, beyond the kind of programming and support and amazing work that I had the opportunity to be exposed to here at MIT, I also kind of took a couple of deep dives into startups, one with Sun Catalytics, which was Professor Dan Nacera's company, with my head under the hood counting hydrogen bubbles. That experience kind of gave me an appreciation for how hard it is to commercialize technology. I'm sure there's many people in the room here that are working it's hard. It takes time, often fails. And at the time with Sun Catalytics, I was in a less mature ecosystem for startups. And so I kind of got to experience that through my own eyes. And then Tomorrow Now, which was a Gates-backed startup, we actually spun out of an MIT company, Tomorrow.io, who's still here in Boston, and satellites for improving weather forecasting around the world. And what was fascinating about that experience, so I founded Tomorrow Now, we built and scaled it in collaboration with the Gates Foundation, and I was able to kind of experience how we could use a nonprofit as a platform for mobilizing people and mobilizing a global ecosystem around this problem, which we were centered on, which is climate resiliency for farmers, and mobilizing technology companies and governments and donors around this really important, critical problem. And I also got had the experience of working with farmers who were experiencing the changes in climate every day and the benefit of technology in helping them feed their families. The second thing that MIT gave me was this early sense that an appreciation for energy and climate, right? Or climate and energy. And this early sense that energy and climate was going to define this century, right? Innovations that are centered around those two ideas together are going to drive the progress that we need. I came to MIT in 2008. I believe the MIT Energy Initiative was founded in 2006, right? So 2 years prior. And I remember, President Susan Hockfield at the time was kind of constantly kind of promoting this message that hasn't changed. It's stayed consistent across the community. And at the time, I was I was working on bioadhesives and studying how geckos run up walls, right? So I didn't really have a deep appreciation for energy and climate, but I did know it was important. And that then, I also, at the time, got exposure to the intentionality behind an innovation ecosystem. So at the time, the MIT Energy Conference had just been founded or started by Dave Danielson and Libby Wyman and others. The MIT Clean Energy Prize was started by Todd Hines and Bill Olet. I got the opportunity to lead that in my its third iteration. So, and I got to see student leadership, faculty engagement around this kind of the opportunities behind climate and energy. And again, MIT taking a leadership role in intentionally designing an ecosystem that could help us all move faster. At the same time, even as a grad student, I was exposed to how the system was increasingly becoming polarized, right? Even back then, in 2008, I was running the Clean Energy Prize, and I had to fight to have a non-renewables chapter of the prize. At the time, we had this amazing company called Oscomp, who, funnily enough, became a founding member of Greentown. And Oscomp, they had a revolutionary compression technology that significantly reduced the amount of energy to compress and transport natural gas, right? And they came out of one of the Energy Ventures classes back in 2008 or 9, I think. Anyway, the point was that I had to work with Pedro Sanchez, one of the founders at the time, to really fight for funding to keep this non-renewables track open, knowing how important it was to continue to decarbonize and bring efficiencies to the traditional energy sectors while we work on all these amazing new energy initiatives. And ever since then, I've butted up against these challenges regardless of where you stand with this, it slows innovation down when we don't embrace and work together. And at Greentown, we have this phenomenal network of industry partners who are all leaning in. They all appreciate the power of both more energy and less emissions, and it helps us move faster as an ecosystem. And we have donors who have refused to fund us because we take traditional energy funding. And we have startups who are decarbonizing left, right, and center, who have formed and have customer relationships with these traditional energy companies, and they are funding them to scale. So it's really important that we embrace this, and I guess this early lesson I took from MIT was this idea that we can't narrow our focus. We have to focus on, we can be better with this kind of, this focus on the power of and there's an organization called Open Minds who have kind of taken on this mandate, and I'd encourage you to kind of look them up and look at some of the work and research that they're churning out. But this, the real opportunity here is energy and climate, and I don't necessarily need to kind of preach to this choir, right? Preach to the choir on this topic. But I did want to frame it much more as an opportunity than a challenge here, right? Because we are in a moment here, and there are headwinds and there are tailwinds. But on energy, there's just no question that we need more energy. We see it every day. Energy is good. It leads to a more prosperous country, nation, world. And we're seeing, I just heard this morning, I saw a presentation where they shared that electricity demand is up 10 times. There was an interesting equivalent. So by 2035, we need to add to the grid the equivalent of 221 gigawatt nuclear reactors, or 430 800 megawatt natural gas plants, or 9,000 100 megawatt solar farms. Right, that's an insane. Like, that gives you a sense of the growth of the and the opportunity behind this energy, the energy demand, the unprecedented energy demand. Another data point, I heard recently the CEO of ERCOT, which is the independent grid operator in Texas, and they were saying that they've already seen, so they're seeing record load growth today, so 80 gigawatts. And they're in the next 3 years, they are planning for 200 gigawatts of capacity. Already, it's planned. It's like in the works. So, and Massachusetts, by the way, I think tells a really interesting but slightly different story. The most recent data I've seen is Massachusetts consumes 22 more times energy than we produce as a state. 22 times. And to me, that tells a story of both we can have innovation leadership in a state, but also like energy dependence, right? And they coexist. And by the way, Massachusetts is not wasteful at all. Massachusetts is among one of the 5 states with the lowest per capita energy consumption, and we use less energy to produce $1 of GDP than any other state but New York. So we're efficient, and we need to be super innovative in order to plug the gap there. But it's really, really important as we think about the innovations that are going to drive and support the energy demand with less emissions, right? Like we cannot ignore the rising greenhouse gas concentrations that are already contributing, right, to impacts on our food systems, on infrastructure, on health, on household risk. What's interesting, right, is that there are now known risks to our health and our environment, and there are known solutions for how we're going to address those challenges. So that's the opportunity ahead of us, but we have to think about energy and climate together, that dual opportunity, in order for us to move at the speed we need to move, especially within the next decade. And this is where we believe at Greentown, and I very much kind of have been influenced by the MIT community in this idea. But entrepreneurs, our bet is on the entrepreneurs, right? To kind of bridge between the science and the discovery and the fundamental work that goes on in the lab to deployment, right? And we have to be very intentional about how we support and accelerate and help those entrepreneurs. Form Energy, I could have picked one of many companies, but I thought Form was a very appropriate example. Form Energy as a trailblazer example of the speed at which an innovator can move from a problem statement to a megawatt scale solution within several years. Form joined Greentown in 2017. Prior to that, the founders had sat in a cafe, and they had essentially said to themselves, I don't know if you've ever heard their founding story, but it's classic for MIT, right? They sat in a coffee shop or a cafe, and they asked them, they said, look, there's a systems challenge that we're facing here. And if we're serious about decarbonizing the grid, then we need affordable multi-day energy storage, not just shorter duration batteries. And how are we going to solve that? So they started with the problem statement, and then they thought about the technologies that they could invest in and build in order to solve that problem. And when they joined Greentown in 2017, there were a few founding team members. They needed access to our wet lab. Fast forward to a few years later, today, right? They've raised $1 billion. They have 1,000 employees. They just announced in the news a few weeks ago that they've deployed a 300 megawatt iron air battery system in Minnesota, I believe. To support a new Google data center. I mean, they're at scale now, and they will continue to grow. They have offices just behind Greentown, but they started in Greentown with their heads under a hood, and they were able to use Greentown and Greentown's infrastructure to be able to kind of build up to a scale where then they were then able to de-risk their technology and scale. out of Greentown. And there's many, many other examples that we can share of entrepreneurs that are coming through the Greentown ecosystem these entrepreneurs are what's going to make the and possible, and we need to continue putting our bets on them and finding ways to help them. But to my point, one of my key points of this talk is that entrepreneurs can't go alone, right? They can only move as fast as the ecosystem around them. This model here is embedded in my mind from Professor Fiona Murray and the work that her and her team do at MIT REAP and the Sloan School. And it's a simple but a very powerful idea. When you put entrepreneurs at the top of a stakeholder model like this, and then you look at the ecosystem that you need to surround them with, there's 5 core groups, stakeholders in this model. That entrepreneur is either going to, you're either going to be able to create headwinds or tailwinds for them based on the decisions and the engagement of this ecosystem group, and whether they're listening and responding to the needs of those entrepreneurs. And something that we think about every day at Greentown, right? There's the universities like MIT, there's a reason that 30% of our entrepreneurs at Greentown are coming from out of state and moving to Massachusetts. Well, 1, because Greentown's a great home for them, but 2, because of MIT, right? And the talent that they can source from the ecosystem here, which they are well aware of, and the knowledge and the IP and the credibility. Investors, right? They're the ones that are able to put forward the capital, the discipline. They have the risk appetite that we need, especially today, in order for us to kind of invest in those transformational technologies and the big bets. The government can either create headwinds or tailwinds, depending on the industry, depending at a local level. There can be restrictive permitting issues for startups. At the funding level, for non-dilutive capital, we can either invest and accelerate these transformational technologies that we know are going to be important for the US, or we can draw back, right? But every single decision that this group of stakeholders makes, if they're making it in response to what the entrepreneurs need, then everybody wins and everybody moves faster. So it's a really important lesson that, again, we think about every day, and how we can better plug in and engage an ecosystem around our startups so that we can remove friction and have them move faster. So this idea that, okay, the ecosystem matters, stakeholders matter, because they help entrepreneurs move faster, right? But where can the ecosystem be most helpful? And that's another question that we think about all the time at Greentown. And also, as we think about kind of continuing to strengthen our collaborations here with MIT. And this is just a very simple diagram to kind of represent the valleys of death. And there are multiple valleys of death, we all know that. But the two kind of, if we kind of could call out the most significant ones, there's the first valley of death, where a company is moving an idea from an idea to a prototype. That's where MIT is truly like world class. We know how to do phenomenal research and fundamental science, and we also know then how to find commercial applications for it. Often then what will happen is that company will get to a point where they have a working prototype or a technical proof, and they may want a little bit more flexibility with their IP, and it's time to move out of the institute, right? And where do they go? And that's where Greentown comes in. So really our focus is that second valley of death. So from that prototype phase to maybe a first commercial pilot. So the stage where an entrepreneur can't quite afford space on their own, and maybe it takes 6 to 12 months to figure out the permitting anyway. So come to Greentown. We're a home for you, we're a community, and we're actively thinking about the customers, the capital, the infrastructure needs that you have in order for you to kind of move your way through this second valley. And by the way, 2/3 of capital-intensive companies fall into that valley of death, that second valley, and never get out. 2/3 of companies. And our success rates 90% of companies that walk through the doors of Greentown survive. That's not the only metric for success, but it's a pretty significant one. And again, it's thinking about very intentionally the stage that the startup is at and where we can kind of lean in as an ecosystem to help support them through that valley. I'll just double down on this point, and I've borrowed this slide from the Trust Center, but it is really important to recognize that MIT has just built this phenomenal ecosystem to bridge the first valley. And if you're a student and you're become familiar with this ecosystem, I'm sure many of you are. But from the competitions and the conferences to Delta V, which is the summer accelerator, to the classes, whether it's eLab or iLab or Energy Ventures or Climate and Energy Ventures, like you just plugging yourself in, starting with T=0, will help you get exposure to the amazing resources this institute leverages. And when I came to MIT, this I should have shown you a comparison. There was maybe 4 logos on the screen, and now look at it, right? 18 years later. But it's just amazing, and it just shows the intentionality and the reason that we produce so many incredible companies, and we get such high quality companies coming through the doors of Greentown is because of this ecosystem. It's also the people, and at Greentown what we see, it's not just the quantity of startups that come from the Institute or MIT, it's the quality of the startups. And data actually shows with MIT and Harvard that we may produce less startups, but the quality and their success they're far more likely to be successful in scale because of the ecosystem they're surrounded in. So you're getting feedback constantly from your peers, you're getting support and mentorship, and that all matters for the ecosystem. Greentown was built to solve for this second valley. It was actually started by 4 MIT startups out of necessity, right? Because they were spilling out of the labs and the ecosystem at MIT. They couldn't afford rent on their own, so they pulled together their resources and they found this wonderful, space in East Cambridge, and they were able to just about make it through. But very quickly they realized that sharing space, the value went well beyond the cost savings, right? It was the shared networks, the shared community, the shared equipment. And over time, Greentown has grown and scaled. We moved to Somerville in 2013. We were actually drawn to Somerville by the mayor at the time because he saw, we took over a car paint shop, and before that and behind us was an envelope factory. So he saw jobs, the mayor Tony saw jobs disappearing in front of his eyes, and he was like, well, where are the future jobs of Somerville going to come from? Well, good news, we've produced 16,000 jobs since we founded Greentown. And that clap, by the way, is all for the entrepreneurs, right? Like, we are a home and a community, and we cluster entrepreneurs and we speed up the innovation process, but the credit goes to the entrepreneurs, right? And we just want to keep them here in Massachusetts and in Houston, again, so that they can move faster together. But we've got this amazing, but the value proposition hasn't changed, right, for the startups. But here we are 15 years later, and you can see some of the kind of wins, I guess, on the slide here. But yes, we are now, we lay claim to the statement that we are the world's largest energy and climate incubator. But that means really 150,000 square feet of physical space. So startups can come to us, they get load-bearing floors, they get high ceilings, they get 3-phase power, they get all the equipment that they need to scale. We also have, we're very proud of our corporate innovation network. So here you can see just a few logos. We have, I think, over 65 to 70 corporate partners who are actively engaged with our startup community. So they aren't just logos on the wall, they actively engage and they plug in, they become customers of our startups, they invest in our startups, and we have very thoughtful ways that we connect the two communities in ways that are respectful to the startups and exciting for the corporate members. And out of the 675 startups that have now come through the doors of Greentown, we have 250 current members, and they've raised, this number is outdated actually, because one of our companies just raised a lot of money. But from January, we'd raised 12.5 billion. And we can add, I think, another 50 onto that today. But the momentum is there. But this is where we are today. One of the big lessons, so I've been in the CEO role now at Greentown for a year, and kind of thinking and reflecting on what really makes an incubator important for an ecosystem. And I think there are four kind of core principles that we kind of build off of at Greentown. Place really does matter. We talk about a digital system, a digital world. I believe that that's also important, but physical space really matters to hardware companies. Like, I say to, our donors all the time, it's like, you can't Zoom a prototype, right? Like, you have to have the physical space. And the fact that we also are clustering innovators in one place, the data really does show that innovators move faster. So the data shows that you get 30% higher patent rates. You get 2.5 times more jobs in an ecosystem. You get higher survival rates. Actually, the survival rates for an ecosystem of entrepreneurs is 65%. And our thinking at Greentown is when you specialize even further around climate and energy, then the benefits to the ecosystem are even greater. So place really matters. And we have locations now in two of the most important energy and climate hubs on the planet, in Boston here and in Houston. People obviously matter, and I've spoken about the different kinds of ecosystem players that lean in. Again, startups can only move as fast as the ecosystem around them, and we have to constantly be intentional about how we connect and drive meaningful collaboration across that ecosystem. Programs also are really important. So we have structured programs when it comes to the Second Valley, but also energy and climate. So and right now we're working with the community, and I've just had half a day of meetings with MIT faculty around this idea of like what are the sectors that we want to be leaning into together, what centers of excellence and infrastructure investments should Greentown be making in order to support the future of energy and climate, and especially to move the needle in the next decade. We run Greentown Go programs, which are time-bound accelerator programs. For example, we have one going on with Amazon right now around decarbonization of the built environment. And then purpose. And I don't think we should, I think it's really important that we appreciate the important role that culture can play in a community, and the shared purpose across the climate and energy startup space right now, both here in Massachusetts as well as in Houston, and across the two, is there's almost kind of there's a high trust founder community. There's a mindset of the impossible is possible and hard is fun. And there's also kind of, just as you have an affiliation with a sports team, or I use the Scouts because my middle son is in the Scouts program right now, but it's the same kind of love and feeling you have for an affiliation with a group, right? Where you have that shared purpose and mindset and value system. And that is what Greentown is bringing to the climate and energy space. This slide, I ended up plugging in some amazing data that Sam and Maho pulled together on the connection between Greentown and MIT. And I plugged it into Gemini, and this is what it produced. And I know several of these faculty members, and so I apologize in advance. But what's really interesting is there is a special relationship between MIT and Greentown. Of course, we were founded out of a necessity from MIT alumni. But even today, 53 of our 149 companies in Greentown have ties to MIT. And that means either a direct spin out, or they're an alumni, or they participated in Delta V. So there are other ways that our startups are affiliated. And you can see some of the names of the companies. one day I'll get AI to put the logos up here as well. But I'm sure you recognize many of these companies, right? They are phenomenal scaling companies who are changing the landscape for climate and energy. And MIT, who I know are already very proud of its output. It's just amazing to see how I know a lot of these founders from back when I was here at MIT, and I think it is really important to recognize that the intentionality behind MIT's commitment to energy and climate and President Susan Hockfield's commitment at that time has led to this growth. Like, there's a question of whether these companies would even exist or not without that intentionality and without that leadership. We need to continue with that leadership today. I can see it across MIT already, but we as a community, like, leadership matters when it comes to energy and climate, as a result of that kind of leadership, this is the output that you get. I also think it's worth recognizing as kind of folks here think about how you might want to partner with Greentown in other ways beyond just sending phenomenal innovators and startups into our community so that we can welcome them in, is the support that MIT gives Greentowners and Greentown companies while they're physically present at Greentown as members. The talent pool that continues to be amazing, right? Like this data here that nearly a third of our new members of Boston actually expanded into Massachusetts from other states. And one of the big reasons for that is the ecosystem we have here in MIT. The connection that several of our startups have with important research groups and departments and centers at MIT, MIT Nano. I can see Vlad in the back there. And it's just amazing that, you know, our students get to, or our Greentowners continue to get to leverage and benefit from connections to labs and resources here. That's what an ecosystem does, power of and, right? And then obviously the affiliation with programs, and Sam and Maho are often volunteering for various student groups, Energy Conference, Clean Energy Prize, and that matters, and then we also have our entrepreneurs often speaking at classes. I teach, I have a senior lectureship position with Sloan currently, and I'm teaching a Monday night class called E-Lab, which is an introduction to entrepreneurship, and we like to bring in founders and share their stories, and there are many classes like that at MIT. But it's a really important part of the ecosystem. So just a couple of slides left. I just wanted to make it like slightly personal for a minute, because we have a really big responsibility and opportunity here in the Massachusetts ecosystem, and I kind of referenced at the beginning the questioning around, is Boston losing its edge? And part of me is like, yeah, you asked that question because you wanted the Boston ecosystem to respond in the way that you knew that they were going to respond, which is, no, Boston is absolutely the right place to be tackling the energy and climate opportunity right now. We've got the right people, the right attitude. We know that we like to solve hard problems. We're all leaning in together, and that's, it's one of the reasons that I moved back at this time. I accepted the job offer for CEO of Greentown from 3,000 miles away in my English cottage in the countryside in November of 2024. And I accepted it at the time, and then moved my family here just around this time last year, at a time where, you can see the Boston Globe article at an interesting time, right, for clean tech. And this is my beautiful 3 children, and actually Jacob, my husband, is also an MIT alum, so I can thank MIT for that also. The point is that this is on our last day as we were leaving England, but we're really coming back at an important time, and I feel that. And it's actually, there was an event that I attended a few weeks after I arrived, and Dr. Professor Yetmin Chang was accepting an award of one of the many awards, right, that he's received in this ecosystem, and it was from the ELM. And he gave this really powerful, and speech, which really touched me. Because he was saying, he gave his story of why he came to Boston and why he stayed in Boston and why he's, and how welcoming the community was here for someone who's coming from outside in, which is actually most of us, right? Like we're from somewhere else and we've come here because we like to solve hard problems together. And I think that's just such a special environment that we've created, and I think a lot of that comes from the community here at MIT and our ability to kind of look outwards as well as on our own doorstep. But that mindset, and actually at the time that was a really helpful thing for Yet to say, even though he didn't know I was in the audience and he didn't know that that was going to mean something, but it did at the time because I just made this crazy move over and I was like, yeah, this is the place to be for embracing the energy and climate challenge at this time, at this moment. And I think just remind yourselves of that and who you and where you are and this phenomenal platform you have for changing the world, because so many people do here, and it's by working together. So just the last 2 slides, but I think this power of and is about how we're leaning in together as an ecosystem, but let's not forget the network effect, right? So Metcalfe's law is this idea that the value of the network kind of grows with the square of the number of connected nodes or participants, right? So in other words, every time you add someone in addition to the network, the value increases. And it's exponential. So with what we found with adding Houston to the Greentown network is the value has increased to our current community in ways that we didn't even imagine. And this is an event that we just hosted recently with some of our Houston board members and leadership in Houston, as well as Secretary Tepper, Secretary Eric Paley, the Undersecretary of Economic Development here in Massachusetts, thinking about how we can lean in together as states to help one another. Through the lens of climate and energy. Like that's just phenomenal, right? And this is actually another event we just hosted where we got Houston and Texan stakeholders from the energy sector and the ecosystem there, along with our Boston friends. And this was one of the outputs. 100 opportunities identified, 60 commitments across our different ecosystems. Like, this is what's going to move the needle for energy and climate. And it's just amazing. I'm proud to be a part of it, and I hope you are too. So I think, one of the things that I think we're asking now is what comes next. You probably can't see the detailed text here, but I just wanted to ground ourselves back through and look through the lens of the entrepreneur, because I think that's an important place to kind of end. So we survey our entrepreneurs all the time, and we look at what are their biggest pain points and problems, and it always comes down to capital, customers, talent, community. And in kind of a priority order. So as you think about how you, and every person in this audience is very welcome at Greentown and can actively contribute to the mission and to our community, whether it's building and come to Greentown and leverage our infrastructure in order to build and scale, whether it's connecting. So we love to kind of connect our entrepreneurs and plug them into the classroom here in the community and vice versa, finding ways to support the different student activities. And by the way, if you're a student in the room, one of the best experiences I ever had at MIT was joining on the student committees, because you learn so much more about leadership by running an organization and being part of an organization like that than in the classroom, although I did appreciate the leadership lessons I got through the classroom as well. And then thought leadership. So this is something else that Greentown is really trying to lean into. We want to be very thoughtful about the role that ecosystems can play in accelerating climate and energy innovations. And we're looking to build a university leadership council. We're continuing to host ecosystem convenings. And we're also very interested in exploring some research and policy opportunities, as well as we kind of try to put recommendations in front of stakeholders that can genuinely help our entrepreneurs move forward. For those of you who are interested in Greentown events, here are the upcoming events that we have. So Houston, there's a big week next week called Sierra Week, which is kind of like the the holy grail for the energy community. And we've got a ton of Greentown events going on there. And then we have several community events. Our June 4th event, Energy Bar, we tend to host those every couple of months. I don't even know if this one's on the roof, that's a fun party. But that's a great event to attend. But just come and plug into the community, I guess is what I'm saying. And then for those of you who want to take a screenshot of that, for those of you who are in Houston next week, again, we're running a ton of events. We're doing some joint panels with Microsoft. We're hosting some events at Greentown. We're doing a ton of stuff in the Agora House for those of you who are familiar. But please come along, sign up, and the information will be shared through our LinkedIn and our website. So yeah, I wanted to end with a story because it's one of my favorite stories. I was at an MIT REAP event recently, and one of the faculty members from the School of Architecture shared this story, and I just thought it was so appropriate for Greentown. So this is the Infinite Corridor, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. But I just think the intentionality, so when MIT moved to Cambridge in 1916 from Boston, and it's a really interesting story, but William Bosworth, who was the architect behind the design of MIT, was a pretty, he kind of challenged the norms of architecture at the time, right? Because he was looking at Oxford and Harvard, and they're beautifully architected buildings, but one of the observations he made is that all the departments were in silos, right? Whereas if you walk down the Infinite Corridor, even today, right, you've got maths and physics and chemistry and material science, you've got architecture, like all of the, but it's not just the departments where there is kind of diversity down the Infinite Corridor, it's the people, right? So you had faculty offices, you had staff offices, you have lab space, and it's just the intentionality and the insight that William Bosworth had at that time was I think has genuinely influenced like how we think about and how we work together at MIT and how we innovate together and our mindset of working together as innovation as a team sport. So I think as we think about Greentown, as we intentionally lean into ecosystems and we think about energy and climate corridors in the same way that we think about the Infinite Corridor at MIT. This is kind of what we, I think it's just bringing us back to the power of right? And the intentionality behind the physical infrastructure and the programming that and partnerships that can help us all move forward. So yeah. Thank you so much, and appreciate everybody's time.
So you can sit down. We can do some questions. So thank you for that really interesting talk. I started actually. I saw one of my company's names up on that slide there, and you commented about how difficult it is to be an entrepreneur. Historically, in this country, the federal government played a big part in helping to support the entrepreneurs. But I think that maybe the new administration hasn't had the same priority about that. I was wondering if you could comment about how things have changed even since you've arrived.
So I think that with early stage innovators, non-dilutive capital is so important for high risk hardware companies. And so ARPA-E funding, SBIR funding is so important for our companies. And I think there are some phenomenal innovations that are currently under the hood at Greentown that are being slowed down because of lack of access to capital at the stage that they're at. So I do think that has impacted. I think there are several tailwinds that I kind of I spoke to earlier, but I also think that there are important communication or messages that we need to get out. Like climate is good for business, like we see it every day, but we also need to be thoughtful about how we kind of fund and support these kinds of companies early in their journey.
Maybe questions from the audience? Front here.
Well, are there other, you mentioned
Sorry,
energy and climate. You described very in detail energy and climate, and an incredibly sophisticated ecosystem, as you like to describe. Are there similar foundations in other things? I can give you an example of health and other sorts of things. I'll use health. Are there things that are similar in scope, but deal with other entities? It seems to me that you've put a ground swelling of information that could be used other places as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I think with Greentown, there's value in focus for where we are today, and looking at it through the lens of energy and climate, not necessarily just through energy, but industrial systems, so advanced materials and improving chemical processes. Often there is a layer across our startups that's focused on climate and decarbonization, as well as other environmental benefits. But yeah, you're right. This model is applicable to any sector or industry. This idea of clustering innovators in specific sectors together in one place is there's the data is clear.
Mass robotics.
Yeah, and that's right. In this ecosystem, there's not really, there is mass robotics, there's the engine, there's Lab Central, which focuses and has a similar approach for clustering biotech companies together. I mean, the Boston ecosystem is very mature in that sense, and we're very collaborative and often have startups that move between the different entities. But it's a great insight.
The concept of being collaborative, because you're going to learn something from somebody else's experience in a completely different field.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the back, Vladimir?
Well, Georgina, as always, a fantastic talk. I really appreciated it. And it really raises a question. Your statistics are amazing on survivability of the Greentown Labs companies. I believe government overall invests maybe $4 billion in SBIR and STTRs as of a few years ago, last data available. And VCs invest $200 billion, so factor of 50 more. And yet only about 1% of it goes towards hard tech the way that you see it. My goal is always to move it to 2%, consequently doubling the number of technologies. And I guess one question for you is, as you look at your statistics, 88% of your startups are still around after stepping out of Greentown Labs. Doesn't that dramatically simplify VC's choice on what to invest in? Isn't that, I mean, because isn't a typical survivability of a startup, what, like 20% or less?
I tell them that all the time, yeah. I mean, I think we've got to be careful. We're not a VC, right? And we've got to be careful not to signal to the community in a way where we're picking favorites, similar to MIT's approach there. And I think there is definitely a signaling effect for the VC and VC community. It's a reason that everybody wants to go for coffee with me. But no, I mean, we've got about 600 climate and energy investors in our network, both on the CVC or the corporate venture side. And then, but there's also, I think, we're kind of thinking more intentionally about how we, when a company joins Greentown, their readiness level, they might not be investor ready when they join Greentown, but through our programming and through our support and our ecosystem, they can absolutely get to a point where they are investor ready. And then how do you more intentionally then signal that to the community beyond me picking up the phone and saying, hey guys, you should look at this company. So we are trying to be more intentional around that. But it's a good observation. And yeah, I know there's not many investors in the room, but you should invest in Greentown companies.
Well, with that advice for the investors in the room, I think we better stop because of the time. But I wanted to let everybody know there's food downstairs. If you go down the stairs in the main lobby of the building. I wanted to mention that we'll have our next talk in this series will be on April 8th, and it'll be Fatih Barol, who's the director of the International Energy Agency, which has been in the news recently. And that will be our Earth Day colloquium. And I wanted to ask all of you to join me in thanking Georgina for talking about energy entrepreneurship and the whole complexity of the whole ecosystem. I really appreciate it.